Okay. Thank you all for joining us for the favorite standing Friday morning, New York time, afternoon, London time. This is our Skills Summer Seminar. We got a lot of feedback, people asking for some other topics. So I just want to remind you, if you want to submit another topic, go to skills.law, go to the seminars and submit your idea. We're going to take a pause after ILTA for the remaining of August. We're going to start after Labor Day back in September with a few more into the fall. So submit your ideas now and we'll include them. And with that, I'm very pleased to hear from Otto and James. Otto, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm the founder and CEO of Midpage. We're a legal research platform, in some ways following the footsteps of Casetext. So we have, a platform where you can look on past precedents, and we're trying to help, especially with the really difficult parts in legal research, a search that might take you many hours or days. And we've been around for 3 years now. My background is more on the computer science side. Um, but for the last 5 years, I've been doing uh, focusing on deep learning, partially for computer vision, but also then for a long time on combining language models with search. And of course, legal research is the biggest search problem with probably the most dollars behind it. And so that's why we focus on this. And yeah, we have been looking forward to this a lot. I also have James here, who's our sort of head of product and was a litigator at Greenberg Traurig before. So he's now sort of building the product at Midpage that he always wanted out of himself. And happy to today talk mostly about the whole context of, where does the collection of case law, how does it work? How is it changing right now? How much control do Lexis and Westlaw have over this process? And then this kind of shows also why there's now a few new companies popping up that are starting to have access to the same data as those two. Um, so I was going to make this seminar presentation only about case law and the history initially. But then 2 weeks ago, we added a second part to it because something really exciting started to happen. We had a lot of people are starting to use ChatGPT and Claude for many different things. Um, and recently, everybody knows that these tools are prone to make up case law, make up citations, and things like that. And so, like this one on the screen here, you see lots of warnings by lawyers to their clients or to other lawyers as to be cautious how to use those. Um, Now, one of the new things that came out a couple of weeks ago is ways for Claude and OpenAI to integrate databases and to integrate third-party applications, like um, Gmail, like your calendar, but also something like a case law database. And so the biggest part today that I want to show is what are the ways in which you can now add new tools into Claude or ChatGPT, because these are like very general purpose tools and they might start becoming much more like Word or Excel, like being sort of these tools that everybody's using all the time. And it might make more sense to, instead of coming up with a new product every couple of weeks, to instead just integrate it into the ones you're already using. And so those are going to be the two parts of today. So first, some background on case law, how it's collected and copyrighted, and then a second part about some demos where we're showing some things that you can do in Midpage as a legal research platform that are different ways of research that didn't used to exist before. But then also how you can take that same data and put it into Claude and ChatGPT and do some really interesting stuff, new analysis and new types of output that weren't possible for either. And then at the end, because there's a lot of knowledge managers here, I thought it would make sense to have a more interactive discussion where we just discuss these use cases. We have some polls and some questions there to hear your thoughts on which of these would work best and which are most exciting. And of course, you can always put questions in the chat, um, and we'll probably respond to some of them right away and some of them after the demos. Okay. So This chart here just shows the number of cases every year. The black bars are federal and the gray are state courts. And of course, the number of cases is always rising. We now have around 650 million cases only from the state trial courts put together over the years. This is definitely a bit unique to the US. Other countries, like Germany, where I'm from, they have nowhere near close to that volume. And of course, even though many of these are parking ticket violations and so on, um, it is the largest database, and it's used to be only accessible or only fully controlled by a few entities that had the resources to collect it all. And if we just go through a tour down memory lane, you probably you're probably aware that all of these companies, not only in the US but also in Europe, those were all book publishers that had the case law first in book form, and that then started opening up a digital library to make that more easily accessible. Um, and so the first, I think, West was started in 1876. Um, Even back then, they had something like these published digests, and they had their national reporter system. So it didn't actually change that much for a while, and they became like the largest publisher of the world by 1900. Um, and Lexis is, of course, a much younger entrant. They started before the internet or the World Wide Web, but they started digital and entered that way. It's more like 1970s. Um, and the whole, yeah, the law is not super famous for being the internet first type of industry. Um, but one of the fun facts that I found during research was that the Legal Information Institute, which is a website that collects statutes and regulations, is actually one of the first 30 websites on the internet. And they now have, millions of views per month. And so making the law more accessible has been a thing that people started trying to do for a long time, and it worked really well for statutes, and it just didn't work quite so well for case law. And so some of the interesting things that happened over the course of the last decades was that um, the Keysight system that you'll know and the star pagination system that you'll know, there was a few antitrust cases around them, and some copyright cases. Like, for example, like now you probably heard of the case between Ross Intelligence and Westlaw, which is a startup that got sued for copyright infringement. But this happened, several times over the years. And one of the successful cases against Westlaw was when somebody tried to sue them with a company called Hypercase to prohibit unfair copywriting of the star pagination system, because that was actually just part of the law that people decided shouldn't be owned by one company by itself. And at the time, Westlaw was the only publisher that had access to all of case law. And of course, the fact that courts publish cases on their websites is a much more recent thing. So at the time, you had to make deals with every single court in every single state in order to be able to do that. Now, there was a few things that West claimed copyright over, like the selection itself, the headnotes, the key numbers, also like the arrangement about parties and courts and councils. And it's still sometimes a bit unclear. All the new vendors now, if you want to build a new legal research company, are assuming that they have to collect all of this data themselves and are having a very difficult time trying to separate what belongs to Westlaw to what they can just use because it's public domain. And so if you look at the more recent companies like Fastcase and Google Scholars, what they had to do is they couldn't just go to the website and get all the information from the course directly, because many of them didn't have everything online yet. And so the only way to do it is to actually buy all the books from Westlaw and then scan the physical books and then basically redact the parts that belong to Westlaw very carefully, because if you do something wrong, you're going to get sued for copyright infringement. This includes things like removing the headnotes and removing other types of copyrighted material. And to do that, you sort of take a book through a scanner and you cut it open. And this process is not enough to build a system like Lexis, but it is a very it is the closest that you can get to do it. And so this is how Fastcase and Google Scholars got their coverage, and they're still missing a few features that Lexis always had. But after doing that for the first time, they were able to get the same kind of coverage on the case law itself. And yeah, and there were some new companies like Casetext that found one of the other companies to supply data to them. Casetext never actually, but most of the time they didn't have their own data supply. At least rumor has it. And so for new vendors, if you want to build a new service, like maybe a drafting tool, maybe some agent that works within Word directly to help you correct your brief or something like that, it would have been very difficult to get access to that data without going through all the slow process. And right now, there's not a single company that has full coverage and is selling access to that data to new vendors. So there's this weird gap in the market where everybody that is new, like us, we've been around only for 3 years, has to put in a lot of work to recreate everything. And even when you go through the scanning itself, that is only one part of the work. The other part is now getting the daily updates from every single court website in the country, which is 5,000 courts and around 400 different websites. And of course, you need to do this every day at a very high level of accuracy, with a lot of data not being available in either of those groups. Like you have to link between them, you have to find corrections, and then and this is sort of the reason of what the moat from the big publishing companies was made up of. It was too much work for anybody to reproduce that for a long time. Maybe the last thing that I want to mention here is that there's always been these case law access to justice movements. Harvard Law made their whole library available to a team that was scanning it and providing that data in an open source fashion to everyone. So all the projects that came after that, they sort of built on top of that. But even Harvard Law no longer subscribes to all the Westlaw publications. And so at some point they had to stop this process because the data was becoming more incomplete. And I think in 2016, this project basically ended. So there is no publicly accessible version of the whole data available to vendors to use. And of course, I'm not gonna. There's this cliche that young startups always complain about the big companies being too big, and so Apple was complaining against IBM being too big, like in this parody of 1984 that they made, probably the world's most famous ad. And of course, then they became big blue themselves in a way. And I think the interesting thing that is happening here is that it is actually becoming more and more doable to recreate a data set on the same level as the big publishing houses, if you exclude secondary law. And the reason for that is that much of us collecting the data from the courts is a software problem, and software is getting easier and easier to build, both with and without AI. And there are examples for startups that have already shown great progress there. Unicourt and Trellis and Court Listener and also Midpage. For example, Trellis has more state trial court coverage than Lexis at this point. And the second reason why it's now easier for a startup to actually compete with this huge amount of work is that some things used to be very much human labor focused and are now doable with AI as well. So if you think about the citator, there's many steps to getting that work at scale and reliably. To this date, there's been a few librarians that compare different citators and their performance and accuracy. And Lexis and Westlaw were at the top, and then everything else was far behind it. We just launched our own version of a citator, which is for the first time something that is more comparable. And we're still waiting to, we're working with academia to sort of review and compare that more thoroughly. But the way these citators work is you have a large team of partly offshore laborers that are looking at every case and deciding, is this overruling some other case, and does it have the authority to do that? And if you think about humans sitting, in large offices trying to do this task for hundreds of thousands of cases every week, this is of course not something that humans are going to be accurate at every time. And so this will probably be something where the AI version of the site data can actually go further than what the human version could. And this is one example. Like the other examples that publishing houses had that was hard to replace in the past was things like head notes. The whole reason why the company Ross Intelligence, the startup, um, went bankrupt in a lawsuit with West was because they had tried to build a feature and accidentally used some copyrighted head notes to do that. Um, and now, of course, the idea of AI generating a summary seems so obvious. You wouldn't need to build any custom system for that. And those head notes are going to be much more customized on what your research question is. And so they're going to be better than just the static ones that you had in the past. And so these are the things that make it more easy for startups to access these things now. What we have today is we focus on the case law itself. So we have these 13 million federal and state appellate cases updated daily. This includes lots of unpublished decisions, things like bankruptcy court decisions and various specialty courts like EEOC and MSPP, just things that are not part of the classical court system. And the interesting part is that we could, with software, build a site header and link all the cases, with the history of which overruled which other one and so on. The same way Lexis does it, but with a much smaller team. And the next part that some other startups are focusing on, and we'll be doing soon as well, is having the 30 times larger number of cases from all the state trial cases. And the last part, which I think is truly going to change how people use Pacer, is when everybody has access to Docker data, because this is again a whole new order of magnitude of data. But yeah, so this was a little bit of context on case law. I think the really exciting part is going to look at what is this actually, like what new use cases can you make now that there's not only 2, but maybe like 50 companies that have access to this data and that are building products on top of that. And so we're going to show a new way to do research on Midpage first, and then show some examples directly in ChatGPT and in Claude that just weren't possible before. And I said sort of we're focusing on really difficult legal research, so trying to help you find a case that would have been hard to find before. And I'm just going to switch over to Midpage to do that. So this is a very traditional search bar. You can use Booleans and see your search results. And if we filter this down by jurisdiction, we still get hundreds of results for the search. What I'm trying to find in the search here is a non-compete case that is enforceable, especially maybe a rather long duration non-compete, which is quite rare. And so Midpage provides a few ways to like really find that one case that matches your facts the best, without hiding everything behind a chat interface that is too much of a black box. And so what we can do is we can already start reading these cases, and instead of opening them up one by one, we can now turn this into a spreadsheet and just compare cases first. So maybe first I want to know something like, what is the geographic coverage of the non-compete? And what we're doing now is just saying for every case, I want to see the answer to this question based on the AI just reading the whole case. And this means that in the first cell over here, it says, well, this case is limited to the entire United States. The second one is limited to Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and several other counties. The third one says no implicit geographical jurisdiction, and so on. And already you can see, okay, I know that I have to have a geographic restriction, so this one may be more interesting for me. And to take this further, I can just add another column And now I'm going to ask something about the duration of the non-compete. And again, it's quite rare for a non-compete to have a 5-year duration. Most are much shorter. And if you think about how you'd have to do this in the past, you have difficulty using keyword search for this because you can't really say over 5 years. And so in the past, you would just do a keyword search and then open everything that you find, and then spend a long time scrolling and trying to figure out which ones match this. And what we can do instead is we're just going to add this column. This time it's a yes/no column, so it breaks down all the results to yes, no, or maybe. And as expected, most of these questions answer with no initially, because this is the rare thing. But now we can just filter across the cases. Here it's filtering across the first 100 search results, and we can just show the ones where the answer is yes. And since this is now a case where we have both a limited geographic radius and it's an over 5-year non-compete, we have the perfect case. That would have been really hard to find otherwise. And of course, we can read this case. This is even a 10-year one. We can read this case, open it up at this specific section where it's talking about that language, and maybe ask some follow-up questions. So that's sort of one of the main things that you can do in Midpage. Okay, let me jump back to the slides now. If you have questions at this point, you're of course welcome to ask. I'm gonna go next into the other types with Claude or GPT. I'm gonna stick with the same question of what duration non-competes are enforceable. But this time we want to do a bit more of showing the entire map. So I didn't only want to show one case this time, but show how do all the cases stack up? Like how frequent is it that we have 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, and so on. And this sort of also been difficult to do in the past. But now what I can show is if we go over back to this, I have the same columns. This is the number of years in the first column, and yes, no for was it enforceable or not. And I can just export this. I'm going to call it live demo. And now I'm just going to go to ChatGPT, drop in my file, and I can say create a bar chart. And I think this is really cool because what is happening now is it takes the table and it writes some code to do some statistical analysis. And it could be something really complicated, or it could be something very simple, like a bar chart. It is not like the old ChatGPT that is trying to come up with everything from memory, because that is very error prone and that might just make things up. This is, you should still verify these systems make mistakes too, but because it's using the real data from our caselaw export, and it's using code instead of just imagining what it thinks it should be like, it is a much more systematic approach. And I'm still busy writing here, but this type of output that it generates is just something that you would have not been able to create very easily before. And of course, these always take a bit of time. Here you can see the table that we pasted in, and you can see it comes with the citation, it comes with the link, and so on. Okay, you've got the table, and let's take a look. So this is every year is one of these bars, and we can see it created the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then 10 years and 25 years. And then, yeah, surprisingly, there are actually quite a few, more than I thought, of cases in California with a 5-year non-compete duration. And green means, was held enforceable. And this is an interesting overview, like kind of understanding more of the landscape of this topic. And of course, you can imagine the same thing would work not only for 50, but also for 1,000 cases. And it's really interesting to think about what kind of questions can you now ask that you wouldn't have been able to ask before. Okay. Now, the last part of the demo, and this is just a similar chart for a different jurisdiction. I think this one was New York. The last part, I think is the most exciting part, is going to be actually showing a demo of using this directly in Claude. Because I said there's this new ability to add third-party applications. And we are going to publish a mid-page third-party application that you can use within ChatGPT and within Claude. So you don't even have to export and drag and drop things over, but you can really use things like search, proposition search, docket analysis, and so on directly from the tools that you're already using. And in the future, also directly from Microsoft Word, because they announced this integration too. And this protocol that is used for connecting new apps to existing chats is kind of interesting as well. I think the last talk that Deep Judge gave was more about agents and how they work and what is an agent. This goes a step further, and if you have a chat interface, you can add several agents into this, and this is a protocol that helps them be able to talk to each other in a standardized way. So now we're going to have app stores, and we're going to have some kind of interoperability between tools. And so companies like us, we only have to build one agent, and it can be plugged into all of these different tools, just like that. And Claude, Anthropic was the company that released this open standard protocol, but yeah, everybody seems to be adopting it now. So let me just jump into Claude. As you know, these tools now have a lot of functionality, like creating projects, uploading files into projects, doing search, doing sort of, long, even a 1 hour research task on that. And we're just going to add the ability to search across case law. But for those that haven't seen this before, I thought it might also be cool to show a bit more of some other tools as well. Okay, so the tools that I have enabled here are my Gmail and my Midpage legal research. And so the first thing, as an example, that I can show is James sent me a few research issues yesterday, all sort of around the same case. And I could look them up one by one. But if they're spread out between many emails, maybe it's easier for me to just ask Claude to do it for me. And what it does is this email integration has some ability to search and to open individual emails, and it can always provide links back to the email if I want to read it in the original format. And so this was quite quick. You can see there are 2 emails, which is all the ones there are. And it was about this research issue where we had a commercial real estate broker, and there's some faithless servant doctrine, and we have to present an argument that is sort of gathering around sort of 2 or 3 key components. We have to sort of understand for this doctrine to apply, how frequently was the form of misconduct, and also to what severity was the misconduct. And if we look at a single case, the bigger picture might not be so clear, because all cases seem to kind of point into a different direction of whether the doctrine was applicable or not. And so the research task is now to sort of understand a bit more, how do all the cases fall? Can we see some trends regarding what severity and what frequency is needed for this doctrine to apply? And again, we would have to look at maybe 50 cases to get a bigger picture here, which would have been difficult before. And it's cool that I could get this directly from my email. In theory, I could also ask it to look across my local file system in my downloads folder, where I have 100,000, or let's say 200,000 there. And I tried this earlier, and it's great at sort of finding things and understanding whether the search result is actually the one that I meant. But here I'm just going to limit myself to showing some legal research. So what we want to do is maybe plot a scatter plot. I want to comparing severity and frequency of misconduct. Before we do this, maybe the simple answer would be do legal research to help me respond. And it can now use the Midpage tools that we added here. It can search across all of case law, and it's now not going to make up things from memory, but just sort of use it like a human would use it in any search database. And it has a couple of tools in here to do that. The first one that it used was just the search. And by the way, keep in mind, this is a beta demo. This is not a product that we have. This is something that we're experimented with to see where is the future going. And since all of you probably have clients that are using GPT as well, they're all going to be using GPT to try to answer the task before they send it out to the law firm, so that they have some understanding of what this question even means. And so it makes sense to understand, what is possible here. I don't think this fully replaces the need for tools like Midpage or Lexis. You still need to have specialized tools. But what you can see is it's actually spending a time here reviewing these documents, carefully understanding, given the specific sub-question, is this document well suited to answer it? And then after that, it can compile a response. And this, in a way, it feels a little bit like the chat agents, CoCounsel, Lexis Plus AI, or Midpage that you're familiar with. Like we have a chat too that can do the same thing. But of course, because it's integrated in ChatGPT, it also knows all the other things. Like it can look at my emails, my calendar. In the future, maybe things like document management systems. Maybe, yeah.
And also, we noticed that last week Perplexity announced that they include now all of Edgar as part of the search. Can you comment about how good LLMs are as a search engine, or is there anything you need to do in addition to make it a better pinpoint to get the actual most relevant results?
That's a good question. So what you really need is you need a good underlying search engine, because the LLMs operate a lot like a human does, maybe slightly faster. They can handle a bit more volume, but at this point they can't handle 1,000 times more volume. They can only do 10 times more volume. So when I do a search as a human, I can look at maybe 5 cases in 20 minutes, and GPT can look at, or Perplexity can look at 30 cases in half a minute. But it still needs a really good underlying search engine, so that it brings up the most relevant 30 searches in the first place.
Thank you.
And this is what Perplexity may be doing with Edgar as well. Sometimes you're a bit limited as to which search APIs are available. But the search that we're using here is the Midpage search. So this is still a prototype. The search itself is very good. And whether prototypes makes the best use of it, we'll find out. So it wrote a small report here. I think Claude also now has the ability to write Word documents directly. But it gave me some response to this research issue. It says there are 2 alternative standards. And it then breaks down the key findings, like I asked, based on frequency and severity. Actually, I didn't even ask that; it figured it out by itself. And then we have a few cases, which are hopefully no longer made up, but actually based on true case law, because it has access to the real data this time. And we could maybe say, add something like this, makes it more easy to verify. And hopefully it would get the idea by itself next time. Yeah, here we see there's a link. If I open up this, I copied the wrong thing. So here it's showing the actual case. And now we're back in Midpage. So it's kind of a way to add more verifiable information into these tools. Okay, and then the last thing that I'm going to show is create a scatter plot. And if you think about showing the landscape, this is similar to the bar chart we did earlier. This time it's a bit more complicated as the chart itself. And so again, what it's doing is it writes some code to create this. And from what we tried yesterday, this might actually take a while. So I'm just going to jump to a version that is already finished because it might take 5 minutes. But the idea is you can ask it to create anything, to do any operation on this data, and it will have a similar results as to what any decent programmer could get you or any decent statistician. So if I just jump back to the finished version, we have this nice chart over here where every dot represents one case. And we have the frequency of misconduct on the bottom and the severity of misconduct on the left side. And we can see with the color whether it was applied or not. And as you can now see, this is actually a rather confusing picture. It's not immediately obvious what the trends are, but where the doctrine has been applied, that seems to be centered more around more severe and also slightly higher frequency of contact. And this is something where you can now click on this, you see the actual case itself. Imagine using this for academic research, and imagine doing this over 1,000 cases at once. It really enables us to ask some new questions about the law. How are things shifting? How do judges decide differently now? Or how does every individual argument, how are some arguments more accepted now than they used to be? This is a level of granularity that you never used to get from any of the tools, even today. Yeah, so that was the last part from the demo. So now I'm just going to jump over to some polls.
Otto, we have a question. Is it possible to get the prompts that you have used? So I think maybe meaning the prompts, I guess, that we're using in this demo.
When you send the email follow-up, you could include it in it.
Yeah, we can also send it to you separately, Monica. But it's actually something extremely simple. So here, when I was creating this chart, the first time I did it wrong, but I just added some prompt at the top that says, make sure to only look at the number and ignore everything else. There's tricks like that you'll know. And we're happy to send over those prompts. And okay, let's get back to this. So you've probably seen tools like this before. This is, if you go to slido.com now, we can ask a couple of questions. And what I'm curious about are things like, what do you think is the most exciting use case here? And what is a good research question that you couldn't answer before? And so James posted the link to this in the chat. And we will be able to see the answers live on the screen here. So I'm just going to jump to this first question. And yeah, I think my guess would be that by now, at least half of the law firms have access to ChatGPT or Claude, and probably every single law firm has many people using it without explicit permission, just because lawyers use it privately, at least the younger ones.
And this is the interactive part where people on the seminar either put your phone and scan the barcode or click on the link on the side, so we could all learn from each other.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a bit of a warm-up question. I'm really excited about what you think sort of the use cases that are now possible, especially around sort of knowledge management that didn't work before. And I think also you kind of asked a similar question like this in your skills survey. And this is probably a number that is changing really fast. So I'm curious whether we get different results.
Yeah, but definitely we're getting way more. I think a year the skills survey went out at the end of last year, so 7 months ago. And I think most firms at the time were blocking access. I'm that's 75 have it today is a huge difference from last year.
Yeah. Yeah. There's also since then one other thing that changes, half of the legal tech tools or the features of legal tech tools are now available directly in ChatGPT, and they work much better there. So I guess also the number of law firms that decide they should use this instead of another specific tool to handle transactional data or something is also going up a lot. Okay, let's jump to the next one. Now, I think for many programmers, they already spend way more time talking to AI than just writing code without. And I wonder whether Claude or ChatGPT will become something where we spend more time in than in Microsoft Word. And of course, for researchers, this might be more true than for people that work on contracts. But still, if you have Word open and you have a Copilot open next to it, I would count that as well. And I think here the answers seem to be very clear. Okay. Yeah, I mentioned a few different ideas. You can just type anything here. There's some other things that I thought would be interesting to mention, like what about litigation financing? How can you assess the value of a case or the likelihood of an outcome? Maybe if you only have a certain amount of time before you want to make a bid on a client pitch. Those are things where you can do much more, analysis than you used to before. And updates, client updates is an interesting one. I was going to ask about that too. Yesterday, I was reading a detailed client update from Reed Smith about the Reuters v. Ross Intelligence case. And then I asked Claude with the Midpage caselaw MCP to do the same thing, find the most recent case and write an update. And I'm not saying that it was better, but it was very good and may have been very helpful, especially if you're trying to compile updates across many different cases. Now, of course, you should really review those things, and if you don't write it yourself, it might not be as accurate. Okay, so we have site checking. I think site checking is a great example too. If you open up a brief now, and maybe it's from one of your junior associates, and there are 50 citations in there, even if they've said they've triple checked everything, do you really trust that none of the cases are slightly different than how they're quoting from them? Maybe they're slightly misleading, maybe they don't come out your way, maybe there was some later ruling that made this case a bit more conflicted. And if you have a Word that has access to an AI and case law, it's really easy to build a site check system. And if anyone has an idea or a question, you can just at this point speak up and make your own point and explain it further. Okay, analyzing contracts and redlining. And this one obviously is less about case law, but there's still some touch points. Definitely has never been done before. Doing both. And yes, maybe for arbitration, if you have things from international arbitration across different countries in different languages. Okay. Now this one, I'm assuming most people are going to answer no, at least for now. But Claude has access to your local file system if you provided access. This is probably the worst thing for IT security that could ever happen to them. The worst thing for the IT admins at your law firms. But it is incredibly powerful. Think about how much time you spend trying to search and find a given file. And maybe half of that is in your matter management system, DMS. The other half is not. It would be incredibly valuable. And I think that even this is probably going to take a few years until everybody has it. but it's inevitable and will probably come. I'd be curious about who the yeses are and whether that's a yes in the future or like a yes now. Then I'd be very impressed. Okay.
Claude wasn't, most firms use ChatGPT. Claude was one of the lowest in terms of firm choosing it as an in-house solution.
Yes.
Haley has a question.
So the question is, for those who still look GPT and Claude, what's your advice for getting risk departments comfortable with the nature of these LLMs? I mean, Oz probably has really good answers to this too. I think that these tools and what the features are in those tools change so fast. Not only what the functionality is, but also what the underlying model is. That if you base any assumptions on what they did wrong 6 months ago, those are probably already out of date. And so if you make your risk management aware of that, that they should sort of relook at the evidence that they have and look at how old that is and maybe ask around what do people think today. That might help.
I think the main point is locally stored versus online. I think when firms are more comfortable when you could download a model and store it inside your firewall, and it doesn't leave your firewall, it just uses the logic that came with it. It comes with limitations because it doesn't have all the latest necessarily, and it requires not all the models are available to download, and they're large, etc., etc. It's not the most efficient way of doing it, but for firms who are only comfortable with things that don't leave the firewall, that's one solution.
And this is an interesting one to debate, I suppose, because this is controversial, even sort of in the more tech circles, but the models are getting bigger and bigger. So the data center needed to run those models is now from being worth 50 million to soon being worth a few hundred million, just to have a server that is big enough that can run a single instance of these models. And so there's lots of scale effects. And so of course these are going to have to host it in the cloud at some point. And there are always cheaper models that come out that say we've made a huge 100x efficiency improvement. And then next month, that same company announces that they've made just 100 times bigger one. So I think this infrastructure is just designed to run on the largest compute clusters, and that it's going to have to be cloud-based. And there might be a very few select examples where the trade-off in the long term lies more on the do it locally side. But often when you're answering legal questions, it's really valuable to have the most intelligent model. You would never, if you have access to a junior associate and a really smart partner, but the junior associate is not going to spill the secrets, you might still want to ask the partner most of the time.
Yeah, and
Okay, so
partly it's just time. People get used to and comfortable with the risk. It happened in the past, so yeah.
Yeah. This one I'm also really curious about what everybody says. Will the library teams get smaller or larger or stay the same? Because I think you get right now when you're doing research, you're limited to how many cases can an associate read in a week. Maybe it's 50 or 100, especially when reading thoroughly. And what is happening is with these more powerful legal research tools, you'll be able to boil the ocean every time. Like even for not so relevant issues, you'll be able to look at every case, even if it's 10,000, that is potentially connected and have a thorough sort of understanding of how does it fit in, where are all the exceptions. And so it is like bringing bigger guns to both sides, right? If there's a litigation, both sides are now going to have this way more in-depth legal research solutions. But they're also much easier to use. And does this mean that research teams are going to grow because now you can do things, you can uncover gaps in the law that just weren't visible before? But yeah, it seems like the consensus is more that they get a bit smaller, which is also what I thought.
I think it's about the same. The vast majority, it is like 1% to smaller. Vast majority say either the same or smaller and larger pretty much offset each other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you have the arguments both ways. One's lawyers are going to be more they'll be able to run more on their own, but then there is expertise that will make you even superpowers. So you do want to have some of those amazing people who can teach you the latest and monitor what's there. So I think the same makes sense to me.
Great. I'm also curious about what happens at the courts if it is extremely easy to start a lawsuit because you can get a very well formulated complaint from one of these tools, and you can ask a lawyer to go verify it, and he spends 2 hours looking at it, and it seems perfect. And you can do this at a very small cost. Is there going to be a huge congestion? Or is it going to be that because everybody again has the same tools that and the court can penalize people for bringing unnecessary lawsuits? I'm curious about the point that it won't change because research is small cost compared to litigator fees. Do you want to explain more in the chat? I'd say legal research is a large part of the bill, but of course the software itself is cheap.
But also the generation will be faster and cheaper, right? You could go now to ChatGPT and say, draft me a complaint without a lawyer necessarily. So it's not only the research that will become faster and cheaper.
Yeah. And of course, there's many cases where you just might not have bothered because the possible damages or possible gains were not so high. And in platforms like Midpage, we actually had several pro se users, and we were always a bit worried about them because they might not be, well trained to distinguish a good answer from a not so good answer. And even though it's still a small percentage of our users, I do think it's getting a lot more. And those are the ones that are using a proper legal research tool. Most are probably just using Google and ChatGPT. Okay, so some interesting answers. Team says this will decrease. Of course, this one here you can express your love for the tools that you're using, or the not so much love. If you look on Reddit, people find the most outrageous comments. And too expensive is the nicest thing that you hear there. But I also believe that many litigators are assuming that the tools that are there today are going to stay around for a long time. Yeah, no more new tools working with the most. Yes. Okay, now I think this is the last question. We wanted to show this Claude MCP live so that everybody can try it out while we're on this call. Now, because it's a prototype, we don't feel it's quite ready for that. We built it this week, basically. And we can't do that. But what we can offer is, if you have a question that you think is really interesting, we'll try it on our end, and we'll send the charge or the response back to you. And we can also tell you whether it needed sort of doctoring or whether it just worked out of the box.
Maybe, Otto, instead of doing it now, people can answer to your email when you send them the presentation.
Yes.
And then they could reply, and you promise to respect all of them and give it to your best.
Exactly, because it might take a while to pull out one of the more recent ones. What we're especially excited about is types of questions that either are difficult, or other questions where you just know that it's not the type of question you would have asked in the past because it would have just been too much work. Maybe something more like, having an overview of 100 cases and how they fall on this question. Maybe some type of chart. Maybe something that could help with comparing costs from a case or something.
Thank you very much, Otto and James. We would love to hear from you. If you could scan it and tell us what you thought about today's session, or click on the link in the feedback. Reminder, every Friday until ILTA, other than July 4th, where we're going to take off, we're going to have one of those. So you could go to skills.law/seminars and see what's coming up. Next week, we're going to hear from Ryan about how to quantify leverage, which should be an interesting one. So would love to hear from you. Would love to hear your suggestions for others. Thank you so much. You're going to get the presentation and the prompt in the email, plus an invitation to send any tough research questions you want the Midpage team to send you back the results.